So we're gonna get started. Last time we did reading, and now we're just gonna do English. So I personally don't think this stuff is too bad, especially if you guys have gone through the whole ACT spiel. It's very similar. Reading is honestly really different from the ACT, like PSAT to ACT. But English, it's a lot easier transition, which is really nice. So with that, we're basically gonna do like the same type of format. We're just gonna take some notes, although it's not as much as last time. But we're still gonna take notes, and then we're gonna have a lot of time to practice as well. And then online kids who just try and make sure your thing is muted. Thank you. Okay, so just some introductory info. It is the second section, so it'll come right after reading, and you don't get a break in between. 44 questions in 35 minutes, so substantially less than ACT, which is kind of nice, because that's, is it 75 questions?
Yes.
So substantially less, and then it's broken into 4 passages with 11 questions per passage, and that tailors out to about 8 minutes per passage, and then you have a little bit of time left over. Okay, so that's basically all the basic info. Now we're gonna get into some just like general tips and strategies about how to approach it and take the actual test, and then we're gonna get into like some more grammar rules. I'm sure you guys have already gone over, but it's good to just kind of review them, and then when we're taking the practice tests, since we're probably gonna have a little bit more time, and I don't want it to be like just busy work and super repetitive, because you guys are gonna get that with your practice like at home. We're gonna go more in depth if you guys do have questions to like how the rules apply to the practice that you're taking. Feel good with this? Okay. Okay. So, and also just a reminder, as I'm talking, you guys can write down anything that I say, because if I tried to write down everything that I wanted to, we would be here all night. So I'm just gonna write like a short little prompt up there. But basically, you don't have to read the entire passage to answer the questions. So let's say like in the beginning paragraph, there's a little piece underlined in the first sentence, and then it skips 4 sentences, and then underlines a little piece in the last sentence. You don't have to read all those 4 sentences in between, as long as you know that it's not like a structure question. So let's say the last question asks about like what order the sentences should go in, then you're probably gonna have to read all of them. But if it's just like a simple grammar question that just affects that last sentence, you don't have to read all of them. And I've noticed with PSAT a little bit more, it asks questions regarding content, which is kind of nice because it's not just like rote memorization of rules as much as the ACT is. So you will have to do a little bit more reading, but it's not like the reading section at all where you have to read the passage and then answer the questions. You're basically just gonna work your way through 1 through 11 and then onto the next passage and kind of read and answer questions as you go. So, the way I like to think about it, that's not how you spell grammar. Okay, that's really good. Anyways, the way I like to think about it is, if you wanna boil it all down and condense it very tightly, there's really two main groups of questions in PSAT and even ACT English, grammar and structure and organization. Now, grammar is typically just gonna be within one sentence. You might have to like read literally one other sentence to kind of figure out what verb tense it is, like what person or what point of view it's in, like first, second, third. But grammar is typically just gonna deal with one sentence. But structure and organization is gonna ask about like a paragraph as a whole, maybe two sentences together, how they relate. A lot of the times it is gonna ask you like order of paragraphs, order of sentences, where should you put this sentence in? And then you're gonna have to focus on one paragraph, not just one sentence.
So for grammar, I know like I've had a couple practice tests with the ACT, and they'll put like two grammar questions within like the same sentence. Does the SAT do that, and how would you go about solving that?
I think the SAT would probably do that. I guess honestly, I don't know how I'd answer it, like, I'd have to see the question
Okay.
exactly, but if we come along one, we'll for sure, like, go in depth with that, if
Okay.
that's okay.
Totally. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah. So, there's basically 3 steps to taking a PSAT English test. These are a little less concrete, honestly, just because I think taking the English test comes a lot more naturally to people from what I've seen. But we're gonna go over these. Okay, so first step, obviously you're gonna have to read the question and whatever information you need around it. But your first actual step into answering the question is to identify the issue. So when I say identify the issue, I basically mean, what is it testing you on? So it could be like punctuation, that's just commas, periods, semicolons, all that. Subject-verb agreement, so does the number of people or things in your subject match the way the verb is kind of like conjugated? Stuff like that. So basically, to do that, there's a couple things you can look at. So, to kind of determine what the question is actually testing, you can look at the underlined part in the question, like the whole rest of the sentence, even other sentences if it's a little bit of a bigger scope question. The one that I find most helpful is looking at the answer choices, because whatever is changing in the answer choices, the most is gonna be what they're testing. So let's say the answer choices changes like the order of the commas, it's probably gonna be testing punctuation. Or if it changes the way the verb is written, it's probably gonna be testing subject-verb agreement, stuff like that. So, second one is you're gonna go through the answer choices and eliminate answers that don't address the issue. So let's say you've for sure identified that maybe there's a problem in the punctuation. Like it just sounds weird, there's commas in unnecessary places. So you know that in order to make the sentence completely correct, you're gonna have to change punctuation. But let's say one of the answer choices changes like the verb, and it keeps the punctuation the same. Since you know that the punctuation has to change, you can cross that answer out, because if it doesn't change the punctuation, no matter what it does, it's gonna be wrong. Kind of stuff like that. Does that part make sense? Awesome. So then afterwards, they tell you to evaluate and plug in any remaining answers. Because if you look at the answer choices in a vacuum, you're not gonna know exactly what you're looking at, but that's not what the question is asking you. It's asking you how the answer choices fit into the question. So either like mentally plug them in, cover up the other ones, whatever you have to do. And obviously it's gonna get a little bit more complicated than this for some questions, but basically what you're looking for is, in terms of like wording and punctuation, you want something that's the most concise. So the opposite of concise is redundant, and if you've ever taken like ACT English, or probably read like chapters on ACT English, or taken Manoj's classes, hopefully the English teachers talk to you about wanting to cut redundancy out. So it says the quick, fast, cheetah, those mean the same exact thing, so you can take it out because it's not necessary, and it just adds basically unnecessary words. And that's not, that's one of the biggest no-nos in English that is pretty easy to take out. Really quick though, with redundancy, it's really easy, especially like once you get into the hang of looking for things that are repetitive, to just choose the shortest answer. But in terms of like making it more concise, making it less redundant, you still have to keep the original meaning. And I'm gonna add and information in there. So if it takes out like super necessary information, even though it's technically shorter, it's probably not gonna be right if that information is necessary to the paragraph, and it'll make that known. It's not gonna be like super vague, although I would just say the biggest thing is just make sure you don't automatically choose the shortest answer. Okay, so do these steps make sense? And again, even if you don't like step by step kind of like consciously do this, it is kind of just it's just a good habit to like get into identifying the issue. I personally think that that's really important, and that helps me. Obviously process of elimination is always gonna be good. So, and then plugging in also really helps. So kind of if you just do those in like an order that works for you, that's good too. So now that is a lot of the information that I got from the book, and I actually find that really helpful, but now I'm gonna go over stuff that I actually use when I take ACT English tests and when I used to take PSAT English tests. So one of the biggest things for me, and quite honestly, I do this all the time. Like I took a test in computer science today and I did this. And I took a test in Spanish today and I did this. I always, literally whatever I do, I always cover up the answers and I come up with my own answer. Just because I personally think that that tests your knowledge a little bit more and it makes you a better student overall. But also you're probably gonna get that answer right more often, in my opinion. But basically it's the same concept as reading. Cover up all the answers and then predict your answer. And if it's honestly a lot easier for English because it's typically either gonna be your answer is right or the answer that you came up with is wrong and you might have to tweak it a little bit or you might have to rethink it, something like that, especially with punctuation. I find this really helpful. But yeah, it's basically the same concept. Cover up the answers, predict your own answer, and then go through the answer choices and eliminate ones. So when I'm taking the, like, any standardized English test, I personally like to start with grammar questions where it just has to deal with that one sentence. And I typically do that because I may get through an entire English test where I don't have a single, like, big picture question. Now that is kind of rare, not as rare for the PSAT, which is kind of nice. But if I don't have to read a whole paragraph or a whole passage, I'm not going to. Like if it doesn't increase my chances that I'm gonna do well, I'm not gonna spend the time. So if I'm like, I don't like completely change my order, I try to work through the test like 1 through 11, but I also do like to start with like easy grammar questions that I know. So then on the flip side, if I come across a question that says like, what is the best order for these sentences? Or where should I put this sentence? I typically like to either wait until I've like read the entire paragraph once or twice, and then do it, or just skip it all together because I know it's gonna take me the longest. And typically timing isn't an issue for English for most people, but if it is, and you think that you're not even gonna be able to finish the test maybe, you definitely want to do the easiest questions first. So I typically like to skip big picture questions like that and then just come back to them one at a time, or just at the end of the passage, honestly. So another personal tip, I like to write in the right answers as I go. So, I'm gonna do an example of this one. We'll pause it. Okay. So, let's say this is a sentence in PSAT English. It says, Lindsay walked, she rode her bike. Now, I'm assuming, hopefully you guys think that that might look a little bit weird. That's because it is. What this is you don't have to know the name at all. I just remember this, but it's called a comma splice. Basically, it's where you connect two complete sentences with a comma, and that's wrong. But let's just pretend that this is a PSAT question. I'm gonna predict that that's wrong, and I know that I have to kind of change the punctuation. So I guess first I identified the issue, right? I knew that it was gonna have to do with punctuation. Second, kind of employing the, where was it? Cover up answers and predict. I obviously don't have the answers on there, but I'm gonna predict that I have to either just do a period. I could add and, I could use a semicolon, basically anything to properly separate those two sentences. And one thing that PSAT or ACT English will never do is, let's say these are our answer choices. We're just gonna do Andy. It'll never give you like So it'll never give you this, where it says, Lindsay walked, she rode her bike. That's correct, because it's just 2 sentences. Doesn't sound great, but it works. And Lindsay walked and she rode her bike. That's also correct. But it'll never give you 2 answer choices that are correct and make you choose. It'll only have one that's correct. So let's just say it had this, and then it just changed the wording on the other ones. Basically, anyways, back to my original point. Let's say this was an answer choice and I deemed that that was the correct one. I like to, actually we're gonna use this. It's almost like you're editing like a paper for your friend. So if you're editing a paper, obviously you're just not gonna read it, right? You're gonna mark it up and tell your friend what they got wrong. So that's kind of where I interject my answers and the right answers. So once I kind of circle the right answer choice, that's when I like almost correct it as I go. And part of the reason that I do that is because it kind of helps me like keep track of where I am, I guess, and the progression of the passage. And also, if I have time, I feel like with English, so many people don't check their work just because it's like, they think they got it right, obviously, and because it's just like gross and it's too much hassle almost to like find the answer and connect it to the passage and how it like changed. But if you already have it like this, then you can just read it through. So that's what I like to do. After I get done with the passage, if I know I have enough time, I like to read through the whole thing with my corrections. And then if I find out that one of my corrections is wrong, then I can change it. Because my corrections are the answers that I chose. So if one of the answers I chose is wrong, obviously I'm gonna want to change it. Does that make sense? So maybe if you guys have time, just practice some of these. I would definitely practice predicting in literally any of the tests that you guys do, especially like reading and English for math. Or reading and English for PSAT, and then even in math, like the grid-ins. Have you guys worked with ACT math or PSAT math? A little bit with Manoj? Okay, yeah. Did you guys do grid-ins?
I don't think so.
No? Okay, so basically grid-ins are like short answer math questions, where it's like a tiny little answer sheet, and
Oh, yeah, we did it.
Oh, yeah.
where you have to like bubble it in and it doesn't give you the answer. Basically it's forcing you to like do a short answer question, which is really good because then it tests your knowledge and not just your ability to guess. So just practice that with other tests too, because it'll make it easier. So, do all these make sense? Need any clarification, or are we good? Awesome. Okay, so 10 minutes. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to go over some rules. Okay, so first thing we're gonna go over is punctuation. Punctuation is actually a really big deal, and especially if the sentences get a little bit more complex, it can get kind of tricky, especially if you forget the rules. So, at least in the ACT, I know commas is one of, if not the most tested on punctuation rule, kind of. So, they're very important, and we're gonna go over the correct ways to use commas. First one, super easy, you guys probably learned this in like 2nd grade, lists. So that can do with like adjectives, nouns, anything like that. And basically, if you aren't sure whether you need a comma or not, let's say it was like, blue sparkly dress. Obviously that's just like a fragment, but we didn't know if we needed a comma or not. What you can do is put an and in between the words and see if it works. So, blue and sparkly, that's like normal, so we need a comma there. If you put an and in between sparkly and dress, that obviously doesn't work. So you do not put a comma there. So, just remember that rule in case you ever do get stuck. Lists are typically the easier ones, but. Okay. So we have lists. And you also need a comma in the event of an introductory word or phrase. Okay, so this is just an example, but a lot of the times it's gonna have, I believe they're called prepositions, like before, under, after, stuff like that. So before I went to school, comma, and then the rest of your sentence. And this here has to be like a full sentence. They call them independent sentences. We're gonna go over that in a little bit. But basically it just kinda sets it off and it's a natural pause. So that's why they put that comma in there. Okay, so this one is a lot of shorthand, but whenever I put end, that's gonna mean independent, and sent obviously means sentences. So you're gonna need a comma whenever you have two independent sentences with a fanboys. So, kind of long, but I honestly think this one is really easy to remember. It's for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So, I'm not gonna write out a sentence, cause that would take a long time. It's kinda like the Lindsay one that I did, honestly, but. So, basic format is gonna be full sentence, comma, fanboys, full sentence. So, like, I had cross-country practice today, and it was really hard, stuff like that. The biggest thing for the second sentence is that it has to be independent. Because sometimes, what standardized tests will do is it'll leave out the subject. So, quick reminder, this is just like basic English stuff, but in order to have an independent sentence, it has to have two things. What are the two things?
Subject and predicate.
Yeah, exactly. Subject and predicate, or just like subject and verb. So, one of the easiest sentences, like, I ran. Subject is I, verb is ran. But if it doesn't have one of these two things, that means it's not an independent sentence and it's a dependent sentence. So it's gonna rely on some more like punctuation and wording in order to make it a full sentence. So again, and honestly we might run into one of these maybe, but what it might do is if it gets rid of the subject in here, then you no longer need the comma. So that would be like, so we've got two sentences, basically say the same exact thing. First one is, I ran and walked. Next one is, I ran and I walked. So, just the difference that that subject makes, the majority of the time, you're gonna see it with two independent sentences, which is super nice, cause then you just need your comma and your fanboys. But in the odd event that it gets rid of that subject, cause now we have I ran, that's an independent sentence, right? But now we just have a verb, we don't have a subject for that second part. Obviously, the subject is still I, but since it's so closely related to that, you no longer need the comma. Cause then it would read as, I ran and walked. And that just sounds kinda goofy and not like natural English. So, I kinda digressed there, but the majority of the time, it will be sentence, comma, fanboys, sentence. Does that make sense? Not too confusing. Okay.
So do you have to put a comma after the fanboy or just before it?
Just before.
Alright.
Mhm. So, basically, the last biggest one is gonna be by the way phrases. I don't remember, but I can't remember it. Basically. So, these are just gonna be like little fillers. But, a by the way phrase is gonna be something that if you eliminate it from the sentence and take out the commas around it, then the sentence will read like well, and it'll make sense, and it's grammatically correct. So, again, this is an example of by the way phrases. It just says, my dog, a lab, is crazy. So, the statement, a lab, is gonna be our by the way phrase. And I know that it's a by the way phrase and it necessitates commas, because let's say I take it out and I just read, my dog is crazy, that also works as an independent sentence, so it's grammatically correct. And basically, whenever you have a by the way phrase, you're gonna give it a comma hug, which, like right here, you just put commas around it, so it's like a comma hug. Does that one make sense? Awesome. Okay, so now we're essentially done with commas.
So for like comma hugs and stuff, would that be the same with like themo words?
We're actually gonna get into that
Okay.
right now, but kind
Okay.
of, yes. So, yeah, now we're gonna deal with semicolons, which I basically got all of my knowledge on semicolons from like ACT studying, cause we don't really go over it in school, just cause they typically use periods, so they can act in very similar ways. So, basically, like I just said, it can connect two independent sentences exactly like a period. So, let's say we have the two sentences, I ran, I walked. Again, not very diverse, but grammatically speaking, that's correct. If I wanted to, I have a period here, right? If I wanted to, I could change that to a semicolon, and it's still grammatically correct. And again, ACT will never give you two answer choices where it's like a period and, like, let's say I just replicated this, but with a period, and asked you which one is right. It'll never do that because technically they're both right. So it'll never make you choose like which one is more right, I guess. And typically, just like in writing, you use semicolons more if sentences are like really closely related. guess for this one it would kind of work, but it just kind of depends, and it's more in like fancy writing, and that's kind of why we don't learn about it all that often in like a local level school. So, yeah, this is kind of where you were getting to comma hugs, but in this instance, it's gonna be two independent sentences with a comma in the thema. You guys getting cold? It's kind of chilly, and I hate talking about this, so. Okay, so same original setup, right? Two independent sentences, just like the last one. But this time, we're gonna be adding a comma and a thema. A thema. For some reason, I feel like it's not otherwise. Do you know what the O is?
I think it's otherwise.
I think so. I don't know why I always mess up the O. But anyways, themo are kind of like fanboys. But again, it just has to do with semicolons. So it's therefore, I feel like there's a B there. Okay. Therefore, however, also, moreover, and otherwise. And yeah, when you use a themo, you have to use a comma after it. So I'll give an example. So, can't really see that, but kind of playing on like the I ran, I walked. This reads as I ran, however, I basically walked. So, I just spelled that wrong. Anyways. Okay, so I ran, however, I basically walked. So this is gonna be our themo, and then whenever we have a themo, we have to put a comma after it. So it honestly kind of is like a semicolon comma sandwich, where you have semicolon here and a comma here. So it's like a modified comma hug. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like for these types of words, there's always a semicolon in front. It can't be comma, comma.
No, it can't
Okay.
be comma, comma. Okay. Does that make sense? Basically, again, one of the biggest things is that it has to be like two independent sentences. So one of the other things that I've seen the test use for semicolons is when it has separate sublists within long lists. And basically every time I've seen this, it's when it's like city, state. Okay, so kind of need to move it down. But let's say we have an example of I like Sioux City, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, and Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So whenever you have like a city and state, I'm sure you guys know it's city, comma, state. So you need to have that comma in there, and that's again kind of just representing natural inflection when you talk in English. You don't say I like Sioux City, Iowa. Well, that kind of sounds normal, but you just need that comma in between city and state. But if you had, like, in a normal list, let's say it was just cities, let's say I was like, I like Sioux City, Omaha, and Sioux Falls, then it would just all be commas. There's no need to use semicolons, but since you have commas within the list, if these semicolons were commas, it would just get really jumbled and kind of look weird. So, kind of an obscure example, you won't see too many of these, but I just wanted to cover it because I've definitely seen them before. But in this case, it is grammatically okay to use semicolons in the places of commas. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Okay, so now we're gonna move on from semicolons to colons. Semicolons are probably a little bit more used, but colons are still. So, basically the only time that you're gonna see colons is when it introduces a list or a phrase and like really tease it up. Okay, so example, I only like one band, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. That's not true. But we're gonna use a colon for that because it introduced like a phrase, or doesn't even have to be a phrase. It could just be a single word. Like, there's only one food I won't eat, tomatoes. That's true. But I guess if you try and think of like any other way other than colons, there's really no way to punctuate this. Because let's humor it for a second and just do a period. The Red Hot Chili Peppers isn't a full sentence because there's no verb, so therefore that's grammatically incorrect. If we did a comma, that could be correct, but there's no like super specific rule on that. It kind of just makes the most sense as a colon, because colons basically act as like equal signs, if that makes sense. And then, again, if you didn't have any punctuation, I only like one band, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, that doesn't work. There needs to be some kind of inflection. So, whenever you introduced a list, or word, or a phrase, it can even be an entire sentence after here, as long as it's really kind of built up. And typically this first one is gonna be like a statement or something. So, does that make sense?
So the difference between that and the colon is the colon has a themo on it?
Oh, the semicolon?
Oh yeah, semicolon.
Mm-hmm. So, I would say the biggest difference in between colons and semicolons is that this second part, when we're dealing with colons, doesn't have to be an independent sentence.
Okay.
But when you're dealing with this, it does have to be an independent, or it does have to be an independent sentence.
Do they always have a themos on them?
No. So it can include a themos, and it will not be a fanboys. So it doesn't, but like, short answer, no, it doesn't always have to have that. It could just be like, I ran, semicolon, I walked, and that obviously doesn't have a themo in it. So in that case, it basically just like acts like a period, but it can use a themo, and if it does, you have to have a comma after it.
Alright.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess I didn't really mention this, but I probably should have. You can't use fanboys in this same format. So, however and but kind of mean the same thing, but you cannot say, I ran, but I basically walked. And I don't know the exact reasoning behind that, I just know it's incorrect, but I would imagine it's because if this semicolon acts almost like a period, I don't know why, I always used to get really mad at my teachers for not letting me start sentences with like but or because or and, but you can't start a sentence with a fanboys. So since it kind of acts like a period, I think that's why you cannot use a fanboys in there. So that is incorrect. Does that part make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So we're good with colons. Again, basically just treat them like equal signs and you'll be good. Okay, so next we're gonna talk about dashes. And when I learned about dashes first in ACT, it basically made it like a hard and fast rule that they almost like 99% of the time occurred in pairs. When I've been doing, like when I practiced for PSAT and as I've been doing some practice tests like for and with you guys, I've noticed that this isn't always the case, but a lot of the times they will come in pairs, and in that case, it's basically gonna be like by the way phrases with commas, except you're typically gonna use dashes when it's like a more prominent division, or if it's like a longer piece of information in there. And again, it will not make you choose between using like dashes and commas in a by the way phrase, because technically they're both right. But it will do that on occasion. And yeah, that's basically it. One thing is, and some of these are interchangeable, like technically you could use a dash in this situation. So they kind of act like colons, but again, it will never give you like two options, like a colon and a dash used in that way. But it could be used to like build up to something like that. One thing you're never gonna see is a dash in between two independent sentences. So if you see that, it's gonna be wrong. And honestly, I think that's basically just because it kind of takes punctuation out of it and it just looks very informal and it's not grammatically correct. So dashes, the main ways that I've seen them is either in pairs or kind of like colons with like the built up kind of emphasis on it. But that's basically it for those.
So dashes work kind of like commas.
Yes,
Okay.
kind of. Honestly, yeah, except for like, you couldn't have, so you could do like comma, or independent, comma, fanboys, independent, you know?
Okay, yeah.
That setup, like we went over that one. But again, you couldn't do something like that,
Okay.
you know what I mean? Cause that's basically like what we talked about before, but you're just like adding that in, so.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so that is essentially everything for punctuation. And when in doubt with punctuation, just kind of sound it out in your head. Again, another thing with punctuation is that a lot of the times, by no means all of the time, is gonna be the simplest answer is the most correct. Like, so the least amount of commas. Occasionally, you're like, the least amount of commas is not gonna be the right answer, so you still have to read through it. You can't just like automatically circle it. But if you can cut out any unnecessary punctuation, that's gonna be the right answer. So now we're just gonna talk about like broad agreement in sentences. So one of the biggest ones where I see kids kind of get confused is subject-verb agreement, which seems kind of weird because it seems simple. So when I talk about subject-verb agreement, I'm basically just talking about the way that subjects and verbs change depending on like what each one is. So here we have obviously a plural subject, they, and run. Here we have she, a single subject, and runs. So it's honestly so like ingrained in your vocabulary that you don't even think about it consciously, which is why it typically won't show you questions like that, because that's easy stuff. But what it will do is it's gonna introduce like a bunch of information in between the main subject and the main verb, whether that's in the form of like, typically it'll honestly be like a by the way phrase with dashes or commas, and then it might like underline the verb and have like run, runs, stuff like that. Basically, if you ever have a sentence with a bunch of extra information and you identify what it's testing and you think it's probably gonna be a subject verb, you're gonna cut away all the excess in the middle. So whether it's like crossing out that by the way phrase in the middle, and then just identify your subject and verb and make sure they match up. Okay, so next one we're gonna go over is each is one body. That's not obviously like an intelligible phrase, but it's kind of just something to help you remember. Basically what it's saying is whenever there's words that start with like each of the girls, or one of the girls, or by body it means like somebody, nobody, stuff like that. They look plural, right? Like if I say each of the girls, girls technically is plural. So you think of like the group as a collective and they're gonna be doing the verb, but since it talks about each, it's talking about each individual girl. So that's gonna make it act singular. Okay, so let's say we have the sentence, each of the girls brushes their own hair, or brushes their hair. And let's say, like this was underlined. I used to all the time completely forget about this rule, because I kind of just skipped over it, because I didn't really understand it. And say, well, it should be girls brush. Because if you think about plural verb, it's just gonna be like a plural noun. So it'd be girls brush, but that is not correct. This is correct. So basically you have to think of whenever there's like an each or a one or a body statement, you have to make this verb singular, not plural. So that's kind of where you get the singular part. And if there's a question that goes over in the test we do, I'll make sure to highlight it, just because I think they can get a bit confusing. But do you guys want me to explain that further? Because it is kind of weird, or do you get it for the most part?
So the whole each is one body thing, that goes with what words? Each, and is it just each?
So it's like each, like everyone, no one, everybody, somebody. Another one that I see in there a lot in these questions that's not in the each is one body. So that's like nobody, someone, is every. So like every person runs instead of every person runs. I guess that one's not that good of an example, but every and each are kind of similar. But yeah, it's basically gonna be like each of so-and-so, nobody, somebody, stuff like that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So those are the only ones that do that though? Like it's
There-
like each, every,
Yeah.
any more?
There are some more. Honestly, the PSAT book didn't even talk about this, but I just thought it was really important to go over like each is one body.
Alright,
The ACT book did though. So if you have ACT books about reading, or
Yeah.
not reading, English, I'm sure it like, I know it gives a long list, but I've
Okay.
never,
are these the most important ones though?
yeah, I would say just look at those ones, cause I've never seen them use like an obscure one from the list, so. Okay, so are we good with that?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, next thing we're gonna talk about in terms of just like broad agreement is parallelism. And basically parallelism, take out the word parallel, and you're dealing with math. That means two lines that continue forever because they have this same slope. So, we're not dealing with math, we're dealing with words. So instead of the same slope, it's basically just gonna deal with the same format. So that could be in the form of like, a lot of the times I see verbs. So, an example, a lot of the times it's gonna come in the form of lists. Let's say it's like, I like running, swimming, and to jog. If I were to cut out everything in the middle and just say, I like to jog, that's right, but this is not gonna be correct because the verbs aren't parallel. Because you have present progressive, ing, present progressive, ing, and then like a little helping verb type deal. So the right answer to this would just be jogging. So basically, in short term, it's just make the words look the same, give them the same format. Any questions with that? Awesome. Okay, so. Okay, so comparatives versus superlatives, this is pretty simple. Basically, comparatives, think of like comparing two things side by sides. That's gonna be when you're only dealing with two things. And that's gonna be when you use stuff like better, worse, happier, sadder, stuff like that. Superlatives though are gonna be dealing with three or more things. So that's gonna be like best, happiest, stuff like that, those little ESTs, worst. I see it a lot of the time with better and best, or like worse and worst. What they'll do is say like, of muffins and cookies, I like muffins the best. But that would be wrong, because if you're only comparing muffins and cookies, that's two things. So then it'd be between muffins and cookies, I like muffins better. So basically, just determine how many things you're comparing and then adjust accordingly. Does that make sense? Okay. So basically just gonna go over like one miscellaneous thing. Who versus whom. I feel like every ACT class goes over this, but we're gonna go over it again because it's really important. So, who in like natural common day speak is obviously super common. Whom is not common at all. Like I never hear anyone say whom, just because it's more proper and kind of sounds weird. But it sounds weird to us because it's just not like, it's almost like slang. Well, whom isn't slang because it's correct in some cases, but who in the wrong context is like slang to us. Like we just use it naturally because it sounds the best. This is one of the times, one of the very few times where you can't really listen to like your inner kind of snap decision, because what might sound right to you might not be actually right, just because it's so like ingrained in common day use. But basically, who is gonna be the subject, so it does something to something. So if you, let's say it's a question like, who bought it? And it asks like, are you gonna use who, or are you gonna use whom? Basically, what you're gonna do is answer the question with either she or her. So plug in both she and her and then see which is correct. So if you did her, it'd be her bought it, which isn't right. But if you did she, then it's she bought it, which is correct. So since you use she, you know it's gonna be who. So kind of on the flip side, whom is gonna be the object. So it's like something is being done to someone. Like they're a recipient of the action. They're not doing anything, they're just there in the sentence. And again, you're gonna replace that with her. So that might be like, whom is it for? It is for her, right? Because if we said it is for she, that sounds really weird and it's not correct. But if we say it is for her, that's correct. So since it's her, we know it's whom. So then again, biggest thing with these is answer the question and plug in either like she and her or he and him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So honestly, I think we're about done with rules. There's a bunch of more rules that are in what you guys are gonna go over. These are kind of just the highlights. So definitely read the chapters. I think you guys are gonna be doing like, obviously you're gonna be doing English, but I think it's like a little bit of reading, a little bit of practice. So whenever all this, hopefully we can use this in our practice. We definitely will be able to actually. But again, we're just gonna get started on some practice. So if you guys wanna take out this green book, we're gonna be flipping to 128. I'll write this on the board if like some of the online kids can hear. Okay, so going to page 128, we're gonna do beauty and peril. Basically just try and employ the techniques and tips and rules that we went over. And then we're gonna do kinda, do you guys like the format that we like answered questions in last time? We go over ones that I think are kinda hard. Yeah, we'll just do that. So 128, again, I'll give you guys like 8-ish minutes. So you can get started on that and then we'll go over it. for 11 for this passage. Okay, is we good with time? Or do you
Yeah.
want to answer? I'm gonna turn this off then. Okay, so number 1 is A. 2 is C. 3 is D. 4 is C. 5 is C. 6 is D. 7 is C. 8 is A. 9 is A. 10 is B. And 11 is A. Did anyone get 10 out, or not 10 out of 10? 11 out of 11, right? 10 out of 11? 9? 8? Okay, looking pretty good. So, what were some of the hardest questions for you guys? Because this one had some weird questions.
For number 4, it was either extending through or extending for 810 miles through. I didn't know if it was like ACT where they like the shorter answers better or.
So yeah, for that one it was C, yeah, extending for 810 miles through. So first of all, the reason that it wasn't A, no change, is because extending for 810 miles in length through,
Yeah.
that's just kind of redundant. That makes sense?
Yeah.
But then since it takes out, so like in B, is that what you put?
Yeah.
Since it takes out the 810 miles, that's still like a necessary piece of information that they don't talk about.
Okay.
So that's kind of where, like, you wanna cut down as much as you can, but you still have to keep some information.
Alright.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
What are
why
the
is
ones we're
810 miles important?
Sorry, what?
Why is 810 miles important if it already says bulk of California?
I don't know, I guess you could make a case, but, that is kind of redundant, but I guess, I don't know, just the fact that like, if it was someone that didn't know geography, they wouldn't know that it's like, they wouldn't know the span of California, I guess, so that kind of just puts it into perspective. And honestly, the biggest thing, just like generalizing this specific incident into like a bigger rule, is that if it doesn't say it anywhere else in the passage, you probably can't safely take it out. But with this, like with a problem like this, I would definitely read around, just in general for other questions that you come up on like this, definitely read the sentences around this sentence, or like sentences like this, because a lot of the times it will say like, California is 810 miles or something. So then, if it already states it, you obviously don't wanna state it twice, and then you could take it out. But since it doesn't state it anywhere else, you have to have it in there. So. What else did you guys find kinda difficult?
Could you go for question 10?
Number 10?
Yes, please.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so at this point in our conjecture, perhaps it is best not to venture any further down our path of apocalyptic prediction. So this is kind of the author being like self-aware almost. He's saying like, well, we've talked a lot about like basically post-apocalyptic predictions, and like what could happen. And I guess for this, it honestly is just word choice and what is most consistent with the passage as a whole. So going through it, Wild Goose Chase doesn't really match up because this is kind of a scientific article and that's more jargon and not scientific at all. So I kind of threw that one out. And then guesstimate is again jargon, that's not like an actual word. And wisdom really doesn't make sense because it's talking about like the story that he's just told. So conjecture works the best, and conjecture is basically like, it's basically like at this point in our story. So does that make sense? And honestly,
Yes, thank you.
yeah, for that one I wasn't even sure what conjecture meant. I just knew that the other questions weren't right, so process of elimination. But what other ones do you guys want to go over?
Could we go over number 6, maybe?
For sure. Okay, so which of the following provides the best combination of the underlined sentences? So yeah, this is kind of unique to PSAT and SAT. I really don't see this a lot in ACT, but it does this quite often, so this is a really good question. But, so, and it's kind of nice because there's no change. It's basically giving you all the information and just telling you to arrange it in the most concise, most logical, like least awkward way. So it says, in addition to the previously mentioned things, there is also the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate. This plate comprises part of the Cascada subduction zone. So even that, like those two sentences by themselves kind of seem redundant because it says tectonic plate, this plate, stuff like that. So you kind of can assume that you can combine them even though they tell you. So the right answer is D. Then there is the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate, which comprises part of the Cascadia subduction zone. So some things to look for in questions like this is that you have all the information. So you do have all the information. What one did you choose?
C.
Yeah, I eliminated A and B and then it was kind of in between C
Yeah, that's what I did.
and D. Yeah. So C is, furthermore, the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate is a major component which partially comprises the zone known as the Cascadia subduction one. Basically, it's just a little bit wordy. Some words in particular that it kind of like repeats just in a different way is component and comprise, because they're kind of like components comprise a bigger picture.
Okay, yeah.
And if you say like component, you can kind of assume that. So you don't need to have that comprise part in there.
Okay.
And then also it says the zone known as the Cascadia subduction one. It could just say the Cascadia subduction zone. It doesn't have to say like, it doesn't have to word it like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Perfect. Anything else?
I got number 3 wrong.
Number 11.
Okay, yeah, we'll do number 3 and then number 11. So, number 3, which of the following would provide wording that focuses on the overall message of the essay? So this is one, especially since it says the overall message of the essay, and it's literally in the first paragraph, like you don't know what it's gonna be about. And I didn't either when I was reading it, so I just circled it and came back to it. If you did that, once you read the whole essay, you kind of figured out that it's about like earthquakes and stuff like that and tectonic plates. And the right answer is, the reality though is as follows: something cataclysmic is coming this way. And basically the first paragraph just kind of builds up like, oh, California is so beautiful, all this stuff, but there's like an underlying feature that you can't see that's gonna be pretty bad. And that matches up with something cataclysmic is coming this way. Does that make sense? What one did you choose for that? Okay, yeah. That one, I wouldn't say, like, it's not really a conspiracy because it's like proven scientific fact, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I should know it would.
Yeah. So, and again, kind of just like generalizing this, I would definitely read like the whole passage before you answer those types of questions. Okay, so number 11, it says, which of these options provides the most effective introduction to the sentence and paragraph as a whole? So again, before answering this, I would probably read the whole paragraph. But the right answer is A, no change. And it says, despite all of these frightening possibilities, by no means am I advocating avoiding the Pacific coastal states. And you honestly kind of have to draw on some knowledge from like what you previously read. Just because if you like read all the previous stuff, you would know that it's talking about like these crazy predictions that might happen and they're terrifying. But then at the end he's like, but don't be too scared, like don't move from California because they're just predictions. And it's kind of just the contrast between like all these scary possibilities, but kind of tying it back to reality, if that makes sense. So are we good with that one? Makes sense? Okay. Any other questions you guys wanna go over with this? We're good? Okay, awesome. So now we're gonna move on to page 132, court reporter. And basically just do the same thing. One thing I did not talk about actually that I'm gonna talk about really quick, because it's very important, are graphs. Did you guys come across any graphs in the reading that you did? Like the reading passages? I feel like it's every like one every 5 passages in a reading test. We'll probably have a graph, and it's almost like PSAT's way of putting a little bit of the ACT science section in there, just to get you like reading some graphs along with like any graphs in the math section. But you don't have to do any computation. Typically, you don't have to do any math. It's kind of just like visualizing it. But yeah, whenever you're dealing with graphs, 2 really important questions, if it asks a question about the graph, is it has to match the information in the paragraph, and it has to match the information in the graph. If it does both of those things, it's probably gonna be right, and if it answers the question, obviously. So those ones are typically pretty common sense, but we'll definitely go over those if you guys have any questions. So again, same thing, 8 minutes, no questions. all good for time or we need extra? We're good? Awesome. Okay. Number 1 is B, 2 is A, 3 is C, 4 is B, 5 is D, 6 is B, 7 is C, 8 is D, 9 is A, 10 is D, and 11 is A.
Can you repeat 1 through 3?
1 is B, 2 is A, and 3 is C. Any other repeats? Okay. Did anyone get 11 out of 11? 10 out of 11? 9?
Yeah.
8? Okay, awesome, that's still really good. So is this one a little bit harder than last time, do you think? Maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, what did you guys find hard about it?
I thought on the 133 the difference like on number 8 between they are and he or she is, I found it just got a little bit hard to figure out which one fit in better.
So yeah, honestly, when I write papers, cause I don't like writing he or she, I just kind of generalize and say they, so I don't like give it a gender, cause I don't like how he or she is, like sounds. But the reason that it's he or she is instead of they are is because the sentence reads, whatever a court reporter chooses to use. So since a court reporter is the subject,
Okay.
it, like the pronoun also has to be, like it has to match it. And since
Okay.
a court reporter is singular, he or she is technically singular as well.
Okay, that makes sense.
If it said whatever court reporters choose, then it could be they. But since it's whatever a court reporter chooses.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, you just have to make sure the subject matches the pronoun. And in terms of like subjects and pronouns in a sentence, that's honestly probably the most complicated the questions are gonna get. But does that make sense? Okay, awesome. What other questions did you guys find difficult?
11.
11? Okay. So, yeah, this is a graph one. I figured these would be a little bit weird just because it's kind of weird taking like data and analyzing it and using it in terms of an English passage. You're kind of used to that in math and science, but it's the same idea, you're just translating it into a sentence. So number 11 asks, which of the following properly uses information from the graph to build upon the author's argument in this paragraph? And the right answer is A, a given court reporter's salary is more likely to be within a consistent range than the other salaries of major legal fields. Basically, all that's saying is that if you look at the graph, court reporters are, the difference between the highest and the lowest is gonna be smaller. So it has like a really small range. So whether you're like a really high performing court reporter or a really low performing court reporter, you're probably gonna be making roughly the same amount of money as compared to like a lawyer. Comparing the lowest performing lawyers and the highest performing lawyers, you can see like from the highest performing 10%, it's gonna be a huge range, a huge difference. So that statement is true. And honestly, for these, you can't really predict what it's gonna be because there could be a bunch of correct statements about these. You really just have to read through the answer choices that it gives you, analyze the graph, see if they're right or wrong, and then eliminate them. So what did you put for number 11?
Oh, I actually did have A. I just wasn't sure about it.
Oh, okay. So yeah. Basically it's just because the difference between the highest and the lowest is relatively small, meaning it's like a smaller range. Does that make sense? Okay. What other questions do you guys want to go over?
Can we go over 2? I had a question because there's a dash in there, but there's not another dash, so.
Yeah, I know. I was like, so I took the tests and then I made the notes. And I forgot about this one. So this one is honestly on me because it's kind of weird. Kind of like I said before, PSAT is kind of different with dashes than ACT.
Okay.
So honestly, I would say I would revise if you want to go back into your notes and like where it talks about drafts, or not drafts, dashes, just kind of note that it's basically like a separation, kind of.
Okay.
And honestly for this one, since it was kind of a weird use of dashes, the way I went through this is, cause I didn't know like how to predict it, I just went through and eliminated them.
Okay.
So, like B used like weird commas, it didn't flow. C, same thing, and then D, same thing. Commas were
Okay.
just in like random places almost. So, yeah, that's my bet on dashes. Basically, honestly, if it ever comes to like a weird dash question, I would do that where you use process of elimination.
Okay.
And then also just remember that it can be like to separate something off. So, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Anything else you guys wanna go over for this one?
7.
7?
You said the answer was C?
Yes.
Why is A not right?
So yeah, this one, honestly, I chose A. So I was a little iffy on this one. I don't particularly like this question, but it asks, which of the following provides the most logical and effective ending to the sentence? And when I read in the back, the way that it describes it is by effective, it means specific, almost. Because when it's talking about like which is the most effective, like which conveys the action more specifically. So A, effective communication, it honestly matches like the tone of the passage the most, that's why I chose it. But effective communication isn't super specific, like how is it effective? But speedy typing is the most specific, and that's what they were looking for in terms of effective. So that's the explanation. It makes sense, but I really don't appreciate this question. But does that kind of make sense what they're trying to say?
Yeah.
Because in ACT what it does a lot is it'll say like most specifically, so I think that's kind of the question they were going for. But any other questions you guys have?
Could we go over the who versus whom?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I actually was gonna go over that one. But yeah, that's literally a perfect example. So it said, defense attorneys and prosecutors are the specific names given to lawyers whom represent the accused or whom represent local, blah, blah, blah. So basically, since it was a who-whom question, I just plugged in the, like, her and she.
Okay.
So first I plugged in defense attorneys and prosecutors are the specific names given to lawyers. And the plugging in can get a little difficult when it's not a question, but the way I do it is I kind of just like make its own sentence, just
Okay.
following the same structure. So if you made it its own sentence, it would say, she represents the accused, she represents local, state, blah, blah, blah. But if
Okay.
you plug in her, it would say, her represents the accused, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
it's the subject. So then since it's she, it has to be who for both of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Awesome. Any other questions you guys wanna go over? I'll go for this one. Sweet. So, oh yeah, perfect. You have time for one more. So we're gonna go to page 134. Family Feud. Yeah, you guys know the drill. 8 minutes again. We'll go over answers and then you guys can ask questions. go over answers? Okay. So number 1 is B. Number 2 is C. 3 is D. 4 is A. 5 is D. 6 is B. 7 is D. 8 is A. 9 is D. 10 is B. And 11 is A. Any repeats? Any questions you guys have on that one? Well, first of all, did anyone get 11 out of 11?
I did.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. 10 out of 11? 9?
Yeah.
8? Okay. Awesome. Was that one a little bit easier than the last? Yeah, I thought it was a little bit easier too. What questions you guys have some difficulty with?
For number 11, it's like clarification, and the next one is justification. Like, how do you know which one to choose?
Yeah. For that one, I said clarification, just because, it says where 8 of the 9 received life in prison. Clarification, like for this, basically just says like it clarifies, cause if you just ended it there, you wouldn't know what happened to the other one. And it doesn't like justify anything, cause it's just a fact, there's no like motive behind it, if that makes sense. Anything else?
I got number 5 wrong.
Okay, so, yeah, that one is gonna deal with possessive stuff. So it says, they devoted themselves to each other despite their family's disapproval, like with families being plural and a comma after it. And basically, the reason that it's D with that option with families is because it's talking about their 2 families and they're both, like, both of their families' disapproval. So since it's 2 families, you have to make it plural. And then, the possession comes after the S with nothing, or with nothing added on. What did you put for that one?
I put I.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that was probably like the second answer. But yeah, it's just because there's 2 families, not 1. Anything else?
2.
2? Okay, so, yeah, this one, honestly, we probably should have gone over this for commas as well. But, cause I was thinking about it, I was trying to think of like a way to justify this with an actual rule, and then I remembered that there's another way you can use commas. So, if you have an independent sentence, which I believe is the first one, yeah. Randolph McCoy owned some land and livestock in the same region. That's gonna be like our first independent sentence. And then it has a comma, and then it's like just a phrase. So this would be correct, like this is a way that you can use a comma actually that I did not go over. So I take the blame for this one. But you can have an independent sentence, comma, and then like a subject. What I went over that you can't have is like independent comma verb. But it is okay if it's a subject like this, which is kinda like what this is. So, since the rules for, or like the results for each is kinda weird, what did you put for 2?
I put D just because I thought it kind of sounded weird, as if like that last phrase almost sounded like it should be a by the way phrase,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just confusing of like what else to put, so I didn't really know what else to put.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was good that you got rid of the original like punctuation, cause like right away I knew when it says Randolph McCoy owned some land, comma, and livestock, I knew that you didn't need that, cause it's just like two words together and it's not in a larger list. So that one's not in D, which is good. But D is just basically a run-on sentence then, because it says, Randolph McCoy owns some land and livestock in the same regions, the borderland dividing Kentucky and West Virginia. So when it talks about region, so like, when it says region, that's basically like the end of that independent sentence. And then that's when you're gonna have your comma, and then it says, what is it, the borderlands? Yeah, the borderlands. And the borderlands dividing Kentucky and West Virginia is referring to the region. It's referring to like the land in general, and that's why you have to have the comma. Basically, the biggest way, or the best way to think about it in general is that, like this rule that I kinda just told you. So that one's kinda on me, honestly. Other than that, I would say the reason that D is not correct again is just cause it's like a run-on sentence and it needs like a natural pause in there kind of. And then just process of elimination for the other ones, so. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense now. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions you guys had? We're good? Okay, awesome. So, yeah, you guys are good to go? And yeah, just make sure you guys do the homework when it assigns you over.